So now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Wayne Turmel. Wayne is a longtime Communispond faculty member and an expert in communication and presentation skills, particularly as they apply to the online world. He's the author of several books on the subject, including 10 Steps to Successful Virtual Presentations and Meet Like You Mean It. We'll actually be giving away 2 copies of Meet Like You Mean It at the end of today's webinar. Wayne, I will now turn the podium over to you.
Good heavens, always love having a podium turned over to me. Good morning, everybody. Welcome from Chicago. It is lovely to have you all with us. I'm going to turn on my video and say hello. And before we get into today's topic, it will be really helpful for me to learn a little bit about what brought you here. We're actually going to use the polling a couple of times through today's presentation, but we're going to start by asking you kind of an important question, which is, why the heck are you here? Is it for yourself? Is it for your sanity because you get a lot of emails that are really awful? Is it that the emails you send need improvement? Maybe written documents throughout the whole organization are ineffective. Maybe you want just some general information, or somebody in the organization said, hey, we've got a problem. Somebody up the food chain thought it was important. So we're going to give you just another minute or two. We're going to remind you that we do want your questions. Because of limited time, we're going to ask you to do something that we'd never do in a real class, which is to hold your questions until the end. We'll answer them at the end, but you can get them in writing anytime. So we are going to close the polls. We've had a lot of people. It's going to take a few seconds to close. And I just want to remind you that business writing has changed immensely. It's only 25 years ago that I joined my first corporate job, and my first task was to help roll out email throughout the organization. So it's really amazing. As a problem, email is not that old, but it's certainly gotten big. Now, let's take a look at the responses, and you'll see that for the most part, all of us want more information because writing has become a really key part of every one of our jobs, and that's something new. So why don't we take a look at what we're actually going to cover in our time together. And one of the first things is some context. Why is writing different from other forms of communication? And sort of once we understand that, we also need to look at how technology has changed the way that we communicate. And then because we're using email so frequently, we've uncovered a number of pitfalls and problems which are both for us as individuals as well as for organizations. And of course, that's why a lot of you are here on behalf of your organization. And we'll look at some of the most common pitfalls, and then we'll finish by looking at 5 factors that go into good business writing that we need to be conscious of and apply going forward. So that's what we're going to cover in our time together. Again, put your questions in queue, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So let's start with, why is writing different than other forms of communication? And the fact is, the biggest factor is it's one way. If we're in a room together, I can see the look on your face. I can see if you have a question. You can ask a clarifying question right away. By its very definition, writing is one-way communication. And it doesn't matter whether that's reports, emails, text, tweets. We send information out. And the problem with that, of course, is that we don't get visual vocal response cues. We have no idea ultimately whether people have read it, whether they like it, whether they hate it, whether they understand it. And very often, unlike with a face-to-face presentation, that lack of immediate feedback can create problems. We often don't know there's a problem until it's too late. Without feedback, you can't adjust in real time. If we're in a classroom together, I can see, wait a minute, what I said didn't make sense because your eyes just kind of glazed over, or you look confused or you look like you have a question. And, when you write, it's really critical then that you get the message and the tone right the first time, because you won't be there to make any necessary adaptations once your reader receives the message. It's out there. And written communication generally happens over time and distance. It's asynchronous. When you and I have a conversation, whether we're on the phone or, sharing a cup of coffee, it happens in real time. Now, we're getting a little closer to that with instant messaging and some of the things that are out there, but it's still not the same ease of simultaneous conversation that allows for interruption, questioning, and clarification. So the characteristics of writing itself are different than almost every other form of communication that we indulge in. And so you can see where there are opportunities and also some very real challenges relative to being there. And the same is true with the technology. We've taken something that is kind of complicated to start with, and we've added some interesting factors. Today, business writing is essentially permanent, whether it's emails, blogs, electronic files, documents, reports, whatever. Those can, in fact, exist indefinitely. I mean, once upon a time, our written documents contained the document, the one we wrote, and a controllable number of hard copies, and maybe one went into a file that if you were physically there you could access, but it's not like that anymore, right? And one of the things that's happened as a result is that it is really easy to share email with readers that you didn't plan to ever read this thing. It's so easy to pass along to just anybody, and in fact everybody, even long after the original message is over. And you can ask any number of politicians out there how that feels. The papers are full, not just with this election, but in business and sports and almost every aspect of our lives. This idea of unplanned readers reading what we thought was audience specific is catching up to a lot of folks. And then finally, with today's high-speed networks and phones and the ability to send everything out instantaneously, it's created a whole new set of problems, which I like to call the hit send syndrome. It's like we get prizes for fast response. And we think that emailing or texting is like a phone conversation. So we dash off our responses very quickly without thinking about necessarily what we've written. And that assumption can cause problems. Any of us who have ever sent an email and spent 3 days apologizing for something it took less than 30 seconds to send understands where that speed comes into it. Okay, so the way the technology has evolved has changed in our lifetime, fundamentally, the way we write. I mean, think about it. When you had to do everything with a goose feather, right, you wrote only what was important. You took a lot of time doing it, and not a lot of people would see it. And then, we got the typewriter, and that kind of democratized the process a little bit. But now we've got so many ways to communicate in writing, smartphones, tablets, computers, all of that good stuff. And the problem is that our skills haven't matched that evolution. In school, most of us learn to write either creatively or for documentation, not as a form of present tense business communication. What did we learn to write? We wrote book reports, essays, stories. Maybe some of us had a pen pal project in school that we dealt with. And I venture to guess that most people looked at writing as a chore and something that once I'm big and in the real world, I'll never have to do this again. Well, how's that working for you? Because up till 20 or 25 years ago, that worked, because when we got into the work world, we didn't have to do much writing. Business was done face-to-face or on the phone, And, if you did have to write, it was mostly transactional. It was the way that we documented our conversations. It was the way that we documented what will happen, but it wasn't immediately. And if you rose high enough in the company, you never did your own writing anyway, because you had secretaries or clerks or professionals who would take your writing, proof it, turn it into something amazing, and then get it to the audience on your behalf. But starting with email, we all became business writers. Almost everybody in the organization sends written communication, generally email, and it's often the primary form of communication for business transactions. White-collar workers receive more than 120 emails a day as a rule. We're doing more communication in writing than at any time in human history, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. And, it's that democratization of technology, the rise of the personal computer. And, we need to think about it. Sales are now made face-to-face, that were made face-to-face, are now being done without ever actually meeting. There are entire companies that are faceless and virtual, with email being the primary connection to the world. And when you add all of this together, you get some very significant changes in the way business writing has morphed and evolved. Now, I want to stop and I want to ask you another couple of questions. And this is, at its core, one of the biggest changes that has occurred probably in the lifetime of most of the people on this call. So the first thing that happens is I want to ask you, how many business phone calls do you make in a day? Right? Do you not make many at all? Do you make a couple, 3 to 10, or more than 10 calls in a day? And we're going to give you just another minute or two to answer this. This is kind of fascinating. Okay, and we're going to take a moment, and I will tell you that I've been asking this question of people for the better part of 5 or 6 years, and the numbers have changed dramatically in that time. So WebEx is taking its own sweet time getting to the polling, but while we're doing that, I'm going to remind you that we do want your questions. We're getting some in queue, which is great. And so you'll see that of the people who responded, and not everybody did, the overwhelming majority make fewer than 10 phone calls in a day. That number has completely flipped. It used to be that we spent most of our time on the phone, and now, unless your job is outgoing phone calls, right, customer service, sales, we aren't answering or using the phone nearly as much as we were. But I do want to ask you this question, which is, and forgive the typo, how many business emails do you send in a day? And again, we'll give you the chance to do this. And just to give you an idea, as I say, my very first big assignment as a manager in the training business was getting my folks up on email. And you'd think we were trying to invent fire and anger the gods the way it was responded. It was really quite amazing how complicated it was. But if we stop and look at this response now, and we're going to give you the chance to do this. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, so it's going to take about 20 more seconds. And as you'll see, it's completely flip-flopped. I remember when people complained that they got 10, 15 emails a day. Now, as we look at this response, only 2 of you say you get fewer than 10 emails a day. That's pretty amazing. For the most part, it's at least 10, and as I say, the average office worker in America now receives 120 emails and sends probably close to half of that. So These numbers have completely flip-flopped just in the last 5 years. And as we telework, as we continue to change the way that we are that we're working, that's only going to happen more. So all of this means that we are much more exposed. And here's a form which has completely taken over our lives. We're doing more of it than ever. And that means that any problems associated with it really put us at more risk. And so it's this vicious self-feeding cycle. On the personal side, the risks are to how others view us. How well do you communicate? Are you clear and concise? Do you ramble? Your individual skills are on display every time you send an email or a text or anything else. These skills are more visible than they've ever been, and they display more than just our ability to spell accurately or inaccurately. It also really addresses how we think and organize information. Are you logical and well organized? Do you have a command of your facts? Can you present them in a way that is understood and appreciated by your reader? How you represent yourself is now part of this equation. Just as in presentation skills, what people see at the front of the room creates that first impression that either supports your credibility or undermines it. The same is true of our writing. How do we control emotions? What kind of impression do we create? We've all heard of careers coming to a screeching halt because of uncontrolled venting in email, that Jerry Maguire moment. If you write emails that look sloppy and, look like ransom notes, what message is that sending? And finally, there's the issue that seems to be cropping up a lot, and more than any of us ever anticipated would happen, and that's the idea of privacy. We need to keep in mind, especially as we blur the devices that we work on, that emails don't belong to you. Especially business emails. They are the property of your company, and they can sit on your company's servers essentially forever. In case of communication with the government, for example, the minute you send an email to a government agency, it becomes public property. It's public domain. And in the case of smartphones, if your employer is paying your phone bill, they're entitled to see any messages, texts, emails, anything that you send, even if you think you deleted them. Some companies even install keylogger apps where they can track what you're sending and what you're writing in real time, which we won't get into whether that is for good or for evil, but it's a fact. The issue of privacy is incredibly complex, and if you follow the news cycle, you know that it's just becoming more complicated all the time. I'm not a lawyer. Communispond isn't in that business, but really have a good hard talk if you're at the organizational level with your GC about what that means. So all of these are personal exposures, and they're important. I mean, if people think poorly of us because of our writing, that matters. But there's also, on an organizational level, and I know most of you said that's why you're here, right, because of what's going on in the company. There are some significant business reasons for getting a grip on the way that you write, particularly your email. First of all, there's the obvious issue of content leaks, what you say. All companies have a vested interest in protecting their intellectual property, their corporate trade secrets, HR information. I know a lot of us are in HR-related fields, and that information needs to be proprietary and it's critical. But remember how easy it is now for written communication to get shared with the world. So you, as an organization and a manager and an individual, we need to know what content can and cannot be discussed in writing. If you've got questions, again, check with company policy, your general counsel, whatever it takes. You know, the fact that we can hit delete, but that doesn't mean they're really gone, lends a permanence to electronic communication that wasn't there before. There have been a number of lawsuits recently in which emails that were years old are dredged up. And on a daily basis, and this is something that we know but we're not conscious of nearly often enough, is that every email you send represents your company. You know, your organization's email, website, logo are part of your business emails, and that makes you by default a representative of the organization. You know, before email, there were a very controlled number of people who actually faced customers. Now, as I say, everybody with a phone is essentially communicating with the outside world, and if your emails are unclear, rambling, contain grammatical and spelling mistakes, maybe are inappropriate, the receiver is going to assume that that's the way your company does business. Fairly or unfairly, if your communication with them is sloppy, that's what they're going to think about the whole company. And as a manager then, it's incumbent on us to know what our reports emails look like, what's going out into the world. If you're not paying attention to the way their emails look internally, odds are you're not paying attention to what goes out into the world. And is it representing the company well? Does it say good things about your team and your employee? And if not, we need to step in. It's a performance management issue like anything else, but an overwhelming number of managers are concerned that they're not qualified to address issues like the writing style of your employees. So that's a huge deal. So for that exposed, what are some of the pitfalls that are occurring? Well, probably the biggest one is not getting to the point immediately. You know, no one wants to reread an email several times to figure it out. And as a matter of fact, they don't. If we think about the way most people read email, we don't even open it anymore. We look in the preview pane and we take a look and we judge, is this something I need to read? Is this something that can wait? Does this matter? And if you don't get to the point very early on in the communication, there's a very good chance your audience is going to misinterpret it or just outright delete it. The length of the emails is changing, and this is something that has changed over time. I would actually submit that the problem now is not that most emails are too long, it's that they are not the right length. When email first started, people basically wrote the way they did in hard copy letters. Dear sir, it is my understanding that pursuant to your request of, and they were written very businessy, and they tended to be very long. Now, a big complaint, particularly internally, is that people are sending one-sentence emails with no context. So it's not so much that the emails are too long or too short, they are not the right length. They don't contain enough information. They don't contain the correct amount of information for them to be actionable. And then finally, inappropriate style. And this is particularly an issue internally. If you've been on a team where the way people write to each other has created issues, you know style is important. And it's nothing more, to boil it down, style is nothing more than the feeling that is created when your reader reads your message. Whether you know it or not, you have a writing style. And you're causing reactions, and sometimes they're reactions you don't want. Are you overly blunt? Are you considered aggressive? Do you take forever to get to the point? Are you timid? Do you sound pushy or patronizing? There is, in fact, a business-neutral style, and you can, with a little thought and effort, adapt your style to your particular reader. So I want to stress that the biggest danger of all of this is just miscommunication. Tone, bad information, not getting the action that you want for the work that you've put into your writing. And in almost every case, it's the writer who bears the responsibility for being clear. I was always taught it was the 51% rule. Anytime I communicate with you, whether it's verbally, in person, on the phone, or in writing, the majority of the responsibility for being clear falls on me. Shockingly, the ideas in my head aren't necessarily clear to somebody else unless I really concentrate on making them clear. And when we put our thoughts in writing, we know what we mean, but your reader may not be able to read your mind. And one of the biggest dangers with written communication is we don't know there's been a misunderstanding until something bad happens. There's an unexpected response, or there's no response, or the action that is taken isn't the one that we want. And one other point in regard to miscommunication, and I know that a lot of you are working transborders and transnationally, in today's global and business environment, we're often working with people whose primary language is not the same as ours. And that makes it even more important to think about how our readers are going to understand our message. So, we have to remember a few things. Business writing is a process, like all forms of communication, right? If you've taken executive presentation skills, you know that there are kind of steps and discrete behaviors that add up to a good presentation. And the same is true of business writing. And the first one is that you need to consider your readers. Now, as I said a moment ago, we're responsible for getting our message across. You need to think about both your targeted primary readers, those are the ones that you're actually sending the message to, and what unplanned readers may access this message. That will help you decide and probably put a curb on what you put and don't put in the message. Secondly, you need to be very clear to define your purpose. Know why you're writing this message and stick to that. Often we put in so much information that our real purpose gets lost. And in the case of emails, one of the things that you can and should do is write clear, purposeful subject lines so that when people are scanning your email, which is all they're doing the first time out, scanning your email, they can immediately prioritize and give your email the attention that it deserves. Subject lines are, if the subject line of your email does not match the content, there is a huge likelihood of miscommunication. You need to organize your information for the reader. You need to structure and sequence your message based on what the reader needs to know. The longer they read your message thinking, so what? Right? What does this apply to me? Why are you telling me this? Why do I care? The more likely there is to be a problem. You need to be clear and concise. And remember, most people only read what appears in the preview pane. So don't bury the message by throwing in a lot of unnecessary information up front. And another thing about organizing the information is you want to think about making action steps discreetly clear by using bullets or numbering things. Lots of white space make each request stand out visually on its own. It's kind of a pain in the neck for us. It takes time to do, but it increases the chance of the audience really understanding what's requested of them. A big thing, and again, this is primarily internally, but we need to use an appropriate style and tone. We need to recognize that as your mother said, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. And the same is true in your writing. If your message leaves the wrong impression, you're miscommunicating. Even if the data, the information itself is correct, if the way that you present it is getting in the way, that's on you. And I will use myself as an example. I am an incorrigible smart aleck. Sarcasm doesn't translate on paper, and I am here to tell you that I have learned that lesson the hard way. And here's the final thing, and especially with email and text messages and the speed of light communication, we need to edit and proof everything that we create. Remember, people are judging us based on what shows up on their screen, and that includes tweets, text messages, whatever. Think about what you're trying to achieve. Who's your reader? Then, before you hit send, you need to stop and carefully reread. Think about the fact that you can't take it back once it's written. It's out there. You need to consider both the personal and organizational exposure, and don't hit send until you're truly satisfied with what you've written. And I'll give you a perfect example. If you have not set spell check on your email platform, whether it's Outlook or Lotus Notes or whatever you're using, do it, and do not hit send if you see something underlined in red. There's a typo. There's a mistake there. Take the time to fix it. Same with text messages. Autocorrect has created all kinds of things, and on Facebook we read about autocorrect disasters, and we find them highly amusing. It's not quite so much funny. It's not quite as funny when it's you. So you need to realize that you can't hit send until you're truly satisfied with what you've written. Now, okay, so there's all these problems, and there's all these potential pitfalls, and there's all this stuff we need to be aware of. So what? What's the takeaway, Wayne? What do we do with this? Well, there are some things that every person on this call can do. The first is to examine our own writing. Go back. When an email creates a problem, did you go back and read the original email? Did you ask what is... how did this happen? Was it misinterpreted? Was it something I said? So you need to examine your own writing. Then, are we willing to offer feedback? And as I say, this is maybe the most important thing that gets ignored when it comes to written communication in organizations, is whose job is it to check for tone and spelling? If I receive an email from somebody that creates an unwanted impression with me, am I taking the time to say to that colleague, hey, when you sent that email, this is how it affected me, or this is what it read to me. Is that really what you want to say? As a manager, are you willing to step in, even though you might not have an English degree and you may not feel qualified to, be the one to comment on other people's writing? You can still talk about what impression that created, and did that get the desired result? And if we don't offer that feedback, if we don't make a collective effort to improve the writing in the organization, it continues to devolve to kind of lowest common denominator. And if they're not bothering to spell check and they're using texting language in emails and the like, then I guess that's okay. And so we all wind up doing it. We really need to be willing to offer that feedback. And I'm guessing that some of the questions coming in queue right now are specifically around that. And then finally, does your company, and not just your company, but your team, have clear, preferably written, precise policies relating to written communication? Do people in the company know what they are, right? Or are they sitting on page 78 of the intranet somewhere that nobody knows where it is? And these policies are not just around email, but confidentiality, proprietary information, Facebook posting, social media. If your company doesn't have those policies, if your team hasn't had communication around that, I'm suggesting that maybe it's time. You don't necessarily want to have to clean up after a bad situation. So to wrap up, the fact of the matter is that when we talk about business writing, it can be anything from a 200-page report to a 140-character tweet. We need to stop and consider all the ways that we communicate in writing, how it affects our audience, and how that's going to reflect on us and our organizations. So we've got questions in queue. I'm real excited about getting to them. Jessica, you want to tell our audience something before we get to the Q&A?
Yes. Thank you very much. So just before we get to those questions, I just want to mention that Communispond has a business writing program called Write Up Front, and it is a one-day session designed to help people incorporate the 5 steps of that Wayne just outlined in their writing. It has a particular emphasis on emails, and there's lots of practice and feedback during that session. So, without further ado, let's jump into some of those questions. I saw one that just came in. It looks like it was more of a, perhaps, statement. Let me just jump over there. So somebody just said that Wayne has emphasized that it's important to say what you want near the beginning, but the person was always taught bottom line up front. So it's sort of just to emphasize.
Well, it is, and here's the balance. Matter of fact, there's a reason that the writing course is called Write Up Front. It's that notion that the longer people go going, why am I reading this? Why are you telling me so what? The less likely it is to have impact. And when we think about the way that people read emails, the preview pane is the primary reading method for email. If it's not in the first paragraph, what's in that first paragraph better be compelling enough to get people to open the email. And so you're absolutely right, whether you call it bottom line up front or the message up front. It's very different than doing a report where you're presenting evidence and then coming to a conclusion. It's a very different form of communication, and we need to be aware of that. So that's a really excellent point. And the way to test it is to look at an email in the preview pane before you send it and say, you know, would somebody open this email or would they understand it based on what's there? And if not, you might need to tighten it up or reorder the information.
Great.
I know there's a question in here, and this is really exciting because talk about how the business world has changed in the last couple of years, is the balance between instant messaging and emails. And, you know, so maybe in the future we need to start asking how much instant messaging do we get in a given day. And one of the things that needs to be discussed as a team is what's the balance? When do you send an email? When do you send an IM? I know that on a lot of teams that I'm working with, what's happening is there hasn't been that discussion, and so you've got some employees who send everything by email. And, you know, they'll send out an email and then sit there drumming their fingers waiting for an answer. And they've got other people who just bombard you with IM, maybe asking for enough information that one well-written email would handle it instead of being bombarded. So are we choosing consciously the right form of writing? Is a brand new discussion that's never been had. I mean, we just kind of woke up one day and found ourselves with all of these tools, and we've adjusted. You know, so quick story. My mother was a secretary for a million years when there were secretaries. That position basically no longer exists. Executives, salespeople never used to write their own communication. It always went through somebody, and my mother was a stickler for grammar and spelling and proper form and tone and all of that, and you know, crammed that into my noggin. But that change has happened in less than a workplace generation. And so we need to be very conscious of that. Boy, there's a couple of questions in here, Jessica, that are really interesting. When is it okay to use shorthand in an IM or an email? And that gets to tone and appropriateness of your message. And again, it's audience analysis, right? Will your audience know what that means? If you're sending an email to your VP complaining about something, is he or she going to know that SMH means shaking my head? And if I didn't have a 23-year-old daughter, I'm not entirely sure I would know what that means. So, you know, that's really a critical thing, is what is the tone you're trying to send? Is it an acronym? Emojis are a really fascinating thing, because do we send them in the message because it's a shorthand for building relationship, setting tone? You can tell when you're kidding. I mean, the smiley face has saved my bacon more times than I can tell you. Or is this a more formal message? And really only you can tell that by asking yourself the critical questions. What is my message, right? What is the tone of the message, the importance of the message, and who am I sending it to? Does this person know me? Does this person have an understanding of the situation? Do we have an existing relationship? So I think that shorthand, text speak, emojis, all of those things are okay under certain circumstances, and we should be really clear about what those circumstances are. And when in doubt, spell it out. Let's see here. Oh, this is a good. When do I embed information in an email, and when do I attach a document? Okay. This is really good. I would submit that you want to embed the information in the email under two circumstances. One is the information fairly short? Is this going to turn into a 17-page email that people are in fact going to have to print out anyway in order to read? So, you know, will it fit on a printed page, 2 at the most? Because that then forms the beginning of a discussion thread. If you're going to have ongoing discussions about this, having the original document in the email is really helpful. Attaching documents is actually becoming less and less useful, and I'll tell you why. Because when you attach a document, at least half the time it feels to me, I get a request later on saying, can you resend it? Because I deleted it, forgot where I filed it, have the wrong version. And that's where tools like Dropbox, SharePoint, things like that really get to the heart of the issue, which is, I need this information, I need to find it when I need it. So the first time you send a document out, that's fine, but if you're using SharePoint, tools like that, really important that you get people to start using that, because that's going to save you frustration down the line. People will always know where to find it. The link will always be there, and they don't have to interrupt somebody else's work to get it. So rather than sending attachments, if we can get into the habit, that would be great. Now, somebody asked a really technical question around the ideal font size and color. And I will tell you that in business communication, the color is black. I mean, just send it in black unless you're using color sparingly as a way of emphasis. Right? So if you want to put something in bold, or you want to call out a certain piece of information by using color, I think that's appropriate. But you have to remember that a lot of email systems, especially if you're emailing with people outside the organization, may get defaulted to ASCII or text files or whatever, and may lose some of that formatting anyway. So it's really important that you write something that looks professional and, you know, black font on a white background works most of the time. Color is to be used sparingly. And font size, generally you're looking for something in the 10 to 12 point range. Kind of the default is 10 to 12 points. If your audience needs to expand it for reading purposes, that's great. But I would be careful about intentionally writing things too large. First of all, you'll get less information in the preview pane. But the defaults that are set up are kind of there for a reason. That's what most business people do. So if you're using a standard font, and it really doesn't matter whether it's serif or sans serif, I use the defaults in Microsoft Outlook. But 12 points, because I'm a little older than a lot of people on this call, so 12 points for me is the default. Makes it easy for me to read, makes it a good starting place for your audience, and a font that isn't too creative or wacky. You know, if you'll don't use Comic Sans if you're drawing a paycheck rule. But I would stay there and stay with the standard fonts, Calibri, Arial, Times Roman, the standards. You can't really go wrong. Let's see, and I'm scrolling through here. Jessica, anything on your end?
Yes, I just wanted to jump in. I see there is one that I want to make sure we get answered. So when you have that email communication going back and forth, when is it appropriate to go offline, off of written documentation, and have a phone call?
Therein lies one of the great challenges of working with other human beings, which is when do we decide that this email thread isn't getting the job done? I personally have a 3 email rule. If the thread gets to 3 or 4 responses and we're not reaching resolution or other people start chiming in, it's time for a phone call. You know, it's going to depend on, are you all in the same time zone? Can you kind of physically, mathematically get together? But I prefer the moment I see that this is getting out of control, that it's unmanageable with all of the various people giving input to kind of get my brain around it, I'll throw up a flag and yell for help. 3, 4 emails back and forth, especially in a very short period of time, tells me this is something that we need to talk about. Now, some of that is because I'm an auditory learner, and a lot of people are not comfortable being the one to say, this isn't working, and so we just kind of stumble through. We've got to get proactive. If the communication isn't working, we as individuals need to say, this isn't working, we need to try something else.
Great. I think we've touched on all of them. If there are any more questions, please submit them, and we will do our best to respond to them after the conclusion of the webinar. Actually, there's one that just came in. Somebody has asked, when should you change the subject line on an email thread, or should you keep it the same no matter?
My favorite question. My absolutely favorite question. Email threads are the work of the devil, and they happen because it's easy, right? Somebody sends us something and it's easy to hit reply. The rule is very simple. If the subject line of the email does not pertain to the message you're trying to send, it needs to be changed. So if you start with happy birthday, and the person writes back, thanks, and you write back, no problem, hey, by the way, how you doing on the Wilson account? And they send back something, and then, oh yeah, can you send me that file? The subject line says happy birthday. That does not tell me what the purpose of the communication is at that point. So you should look at the subject line as the headline in a newspaper. The headline should tell you what you're about to read and whether or not you should care. If the subject line no longer does that, it's time to change the subject line.
Excellent. Okay, I think that concludes the questions portion. And if, like I said, if anybody has any more questions, oh, sorry, one more. I know we want to stay within the hour, so when should you truncate the email? Should you keep it going and going or cut it down after a certain point?
Again, what the purpose of the email thread, I'm presuming, is to be able to reference what's happened. Once the email thread gets above 4 or 5, I find that there's a lot of information that adds no value. Thank you. That was great. Whatever. When it starts to get too long, I like to remove all of the unnecessary emails and cut and paste the original email into the bottom of a new email. So that if that's what we're referencing, people can still reference it, but they don't have to scroll for 5 or 6 pages to get to the critical information. Again, it's taking responsibility for making sure the communication accomplishes what it's supposed to do. So I'm all in favor of truncating. Like I say, if it gets too long, I will just cut and paste the original email into a new one and start a new thread, because we don't need to read, thank you, this is great, thanks from everybody who's involved. But
Okay.
then I'm old and cranky, so.
Thank you, Wayne. And moving on, just want to remind everybody that, oh, Wayne, if you can progress the slide, our giveaways, we'll be raffling off 1 free Android tablet and 2 free executive presentation skills gift certificates. And Wayne will be reaching out to the winner of the free Meet Like You Mean It book. And just want to thank everybody for attending today. Thank you, Wayne, for giving us some valuable insights. And if anybody has any other questions or you think you might be interested in learning more about Right Up Front, you will be taken to our homepage as you X out of the webinar. And if you click on Contact, please just shoot us an email on the website. And without further ado, thank you very much, and I hope to see you at next month's webinar.